All right, Perry, we're going to get started now.
Okay.
Welcome to our second installment of the Haverford Alumni in the Arena. My name is Andrew Bailey, and I'm a proud member of the class of 2002, and I serve as the Director of Alumni Relations at Haverford. Before we get started, please note that the audience is encouraged to ask questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will spend the last 5 to 10 minutes of the presentation answering any questions that are submitted. And now to our guest speaker. Perry Hamilton is a member of the class of 1970 and is currently serving as Secretary of the Lower Merion Historical Society. We are pleased to introduce Perry tonight as he takes a deeper dive into the contribution and influence of Alexander and Lois Cassatt, which he feels was necessary for the genesis of the Haverford School and likely impacted generations of Haverford School students through the 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Perry as he takes us back in time to discuss the Haverford School and the Cassatt mark on education. Perry.
Thank you, Andrew, and nice to see you and everybody tonight. I could only be happier if we were all actually on campus, being able to mingle among each other, but I'm glad to be here, especially to talk about Haverford School. I remain very grateful that my parents sent me to Haverford. I've always loved the Haverford School. A couple notes before we get started. I had to come up with this title more than a month ago, and since then, I would change it. I would include Lois Cassatt, Alexander Cassatt's wife. She was quite a dynamo, I think. I think she was probably a very impressive person. The other thing I want to do is I want to give a shout out of thanks to Alan Wood. I believe he's class of 63. Alan was very helpful to me understanding that early history of the Haverford School. Again, I'll point out my name is Perry Hamilton. I am the Haverford School class of 1970, but I'm also a board member at the Lower Merion Historical Society located in Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania. We are a very high quality historical society with a complete archive room of primary historical resource. And I encourage all of you to come visit us when the COVID's over. We're closed for COVID, but when it's over. And also, we'd be very helpful to have your support. I want to point out among all the Fords here on this call, I also am joined on the board of the Lower Merion Historical Society with Ken Breyer, class of 68, and our executive director, George Lonsdorf, who's also the class of 68. So at the Historical Society, I get to work with some of the good old Haverford School guys. We're beginning to talk about Alexander Cassatt. This is a photograph of A.J. Cassatt in his latest years. He was at this point president of the railroad in the early 1900s. What happened was in September of 1882, A.J. Cassatt retired as the first vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He had served over 21 years with the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was 43 years old. He was a wealthy man, and he was in good health. But he was retiring from the Pennsylvania Railroad after all those years. He had business plans for his retirement. First plan was to join the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Railroad, for whom he worked. And just a few months later, beginning January of 1883, he was elected to a seat on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he held that seat until his death in 1906. Also, for business, he planned to build a railroad himself, his own railroad, the New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk Railroad. This railroad would go from New York through Philadelphia, then all the way down the Delmarva Peninsula to Cape Charles or Charles City at the end of Delmarva, and then cross the Chesapeake Bay to the city of Norfolk. It's the crossing of the bay that was so challenging, and Alexander Cassatt, with his engineering background, was able to do a very good job. That became a profitable, good railroad that was purchased from the Cassatt family after he died. I believe they bought it in 1908. But for retirement, Cassatt had personal plans. Number one on his hit parade was to breed racehorses. Cassatt was a real fan of horse racing. And so he had two places for breeding racehorses. One was his farm in Haverford called Cheswold, located right behind the Merion Cricket Club. And the other was Chesterbrook. Chesterbrook is now a development of Chesterbrook, but that was originally the Cassatt farm. It's right out 252, not far from the Valley Forge Park. It has a Wayne zip code, but so I guess we call it Wayne. Additionally, he was elected to the Lower Merion Township Board of Supervisors, where he was specifically put in charge of road improvement, of which he did a very good job. He held that position of township supervisor, I believe until the late 1890s, like 1898. Also, when Alexander Cassatt first moved to Haverford, it was about 1871, he bought Lancaster Avenue. Basically, what he did was he bought Route 30 in Lower Merion, and that became his private property. And so he called it the Lancaster Turnpike because he located turnpikes along the way where people had to pay tolls. And he used the toll money to improve that road and perhaps even enrich himself, and also encourage people to use the train. So he was that. Now, in his retirement, his oldest son, Edward, was to attend the Haverford College nearby. It was walking distance away from where they lived at Cheswold. But he wanted his son to attend private school also. There were no other schools in Lower Merion other than the Lower Merion public schools. And though they were the best public schools and have always been the best public schools in the state of Pennsylvania, they weren't what Lois and Alexander Cassatt were looking for. And so this drove Lois Cassatt in particular, and to bring her husband involved, to develop what we now know today as the Haverford School. Now, at this point, we want to take a look at Cassatt's remarkable career. He had an incredible career with the Pennsylvania Railroad. I want to tell you a little bit about his background. He was born in 1839 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And his father started his own bank, and his father became rather successful, not uber successful, not the great, but he was quite well to do. And his father was inclined to do a lot of moving. And they did. They moved many times. And so by the age of 12, Alexander Cassatt had attended 5 different schools and had moved to many different locations. But in 1851, at the age of 12, his father, again with this wanderlust, moved his whole family, Alex and sisters and everybody. He moved everybody to live in France, Paris, France. And that is where Alexander Cassatt was educated, France. And he also did some schooling in Germany. And then he returned back to Philadelphia. His family came back to Philadelphia. And then when he was 17 years old, he finished school in Germany. He came back to Philadelphia. Interesting to note that when he came back to Philadelphia as a 17-year-old, his first language was French. He knew French better than he knew English almost. Importantly enough, he attended the Rensselaer Academy when he was 20 years old. Rensselaer Polytech Institute was a very terrific and special, uniquely special educational experience. I pointed out because in putting together the Haverford School, I think much of that experience of Rensselaer worked its way into the Haverford School. And then after Rensselaer, he went down to Georgia and worked for a railroad there, but the Civil War started. He didn't even like the South very much anyway. So in 1861, he comes up and he's hired by the Pennsylvania Railroad as a rodman. Now, while he was working out in Western Pennsylvania, he came to the notice of the vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who was very impressed by him. And so now we see, as you can see on the slide here, quite a meteoric rise. In 1867, he's 28 years old, and he was made superintendent of the shops, the Pennsylvania Railroad shops in Altoona. Altoona of the Pennsylvania Railroad are the largest railroad shops in the world. And here he is at 28 years old, and he's in charge, and he's doing a bang-up job. He's very good at it. A few years later, it's 1871, he's made general manager of the entire Pennsylvania Railroad. That's a big deal. 1871, the Pennsylvania Railroad is now the largest business corporation in the world, by far the largest railroad in the world, and certainly the largest in America. And he's the general manager in charge of it all. His office was located in, what is today the campus of Drexel University. It's around 32nd or 33rd Street off of Market. And many of the railroad executives in those days, and they were becoming quite wealthy at this point, and they all lived in Powelton Village. Powelton Village was a very exclusive, upscale neighborhood of the Philadelphia area, and that's where many of these guys worked, but not Cassatt. Cassatt started a trend. He bought a farm out in Haverford, 52 acres, called Cheswold. And any of you who've gone out Montgomery Avenue and know where the Merion Cricket Club is, the farm Cheswold is behind the Merion Cricket Club. And like I said, 54 acres of beautiful farmland, which was for breeding racehorses. And that's where he lived, and that's where he brought his family. But he wasn't alone. Many executives of the Pennsylvania Railroad moved out to Lower Merion along with him. I want to mention what I think to be the reasons, and as I read, you have to make conjecture here a little bit. The reason for Cassatt's amazing success. The reason for his success, he was multi-talented. He was not just a one-trick pony. He was very good at civil engineering, no doubt about it. But he was also very good at mechanical engineering. This is a guy who in his 20s could engineer a locomotive, and he did. Very often when he took the train, he took over the controls in the locomotive and he drove that locomotive so that he become familiar with the rolling stock of the railroad and what it took to drive the railroad. But in addition to that, he was very good at bookkeeping, very good with numbers, and he was also a very good business negotiator. Now, we all know in business, a lot of people have one thing or another. They may be very good at the craft, but lousy at business. But when you have a guy like Cassatt who puts it all together, that's a very valuable person and someone who's capable of running the whole show. Now, in order to understand the starting of Haverford School, we have to have an understanding of the Pennsylvania Railroad, why it came to be, and what it's all about. The Pennsylvania Railroad was unique because it was not purely a business corporation. The Pennsylvania Railroad was conceived as a business with a civic mission. And I have speculated myself that had the Pennsylvania Railroad been formed under the laws of 1965 or later, 1969 or later, it would have been a 501c3 because as a business, it was not a good prospect. And they really had trouble getting people to invest in it because it just didn't have a good business plan. Couldn't. But when it had the civic mission, then they were able to raise the money. Now we can see from this drainage map, William Penn and the Quakers who came with them, and they developed Pennsylvania, they soon realized that they had an economic challenge. Trade routes naturally follow river valleys, and we see from this drainage map of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia can only expect a small sliver of the bounty of Pennsylvania. I think you can see that pale yellow area in the center. That all goes to Baltimore. When you follow the creeks, the rivers, the streams, all leading to the Susquehanna River, forget Philadelphia. That goes straight to Baltimore. And even worse is when you look west, you can see the star there that's called Pittsburgh. All of that trade goes to Pittsburgh, and from Pittsburgh, really it goes down to New Orleans. It goes to Ohio River, Mississippi, and down to New Orleans. So Philadelphia is going to be left out of all of that. And they tried building canals, but there wasn't the natural water supply. That didn't work. It had to be done by railroad. And to build a railroad was not a good prospect. But things got even worse. By the early 1800s, New York City had surpassed Philadelphia, up till then the largest city in the United States, surpassed Philadelphia in tonnage at the port. That is to say, New York City was now to become America's foremost port. On top of that, New York City now had the Erie Canal, which meant it had a water level route to the Midwest. From New York City, you could go up the Hudson River, climb up the banks of the Hudson, get into the Erie Canal, and it was pretty much flat all the way to Buffalo, which is Lake Erie. And once you're at Lake Erie, it's a very easy route to get around the Great Lakes, and you're at Chicago, and you've got the key to the Midwest. So it looked like New York City really had us, and it looked like we had nothing going on. Also, matters were even a little bit worse. Take a look at the map, and you'll see right below the Mason-Dixon line out west, Cumberland, Maryland. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had completed their line to Cumberland, Maryland, and beyond, and they now realized that they had a real easy build to get to Pittsburgh. They wanted to get to Pittsburgh. If the Baltimore and Ohio could connect Pittsburgh and then get to Baltimore and up to New York City, that was going to be the premier line of the United States of America. Whichever railroad was going to carry the most to New York City, that was the railroad that was going to be the biggest and the best. And it looked like the B&O was going to be it. So here's what happened. Early January 1846, the Baltimore and Ohio appeals to the Pennsylvania State Legislature. They want to build a railroad from Cumberland to Pittsburgh. End of game. Philly's done. The Quakers at Philadelphia said, we got to take one last stab at it. They said, we have just formed a company, and the company's called the Pennsylvania Railroad, and we want that right of way. So and now the people in Pittsburgh, the hell with Philly. They didn't like those Quakers anyway. They wanted the Baltimore and Ohio. So there was quite a battle there in the legislature. What happened was they made a deal. If by April, 90 days, the Pennsylvania Railroad failed to build any more than 30 miles out of Pittsburgh East and 30 miles out of Harrisburg West, and also at the same time raise $1 million capital money. That was real money in those days. If they failed to do that, then the Baltimore and Ohio was going to get their right of way. But if the Pennsylvania Railroad could do it, then the B&O was shut out and the Pennsylvania was going to go. Well, thanks to the great engineering of the chief engineer, J. Edgar Thompson, the Pennsylvania Railroad did complete the mission. And by 1854, trains were regularly running nonstop, or well, with stops, between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And the Pennsylvania Railroad was on its way to becoming the greatest railroad in the world, actually. And by necessity, by nature of topography, it had to go through Lower Merion. This is a map of the Pennsylvania Railroad at its maturity. And I think what I really tried to point out to you with these red ovals here, the Pennsylvania Railroad connected New York to and through Philadelphia, to Pittsburgh, which I don't see the red circle around. I missed it. Anyway, to Pittsburgh. And then they connected to Chicago and St. Louis. St. Louis was the gateway to the West. Chicago was the top of the Midwest. They were key cities. Pennsylvania had direct lines to them, and it was the prize. At this point, by 1870, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest business corporation in the world, any way that you measure it. Revenues, profits, assets, equity, marketable stock value, any way you want to measure the size of a business corporation, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the biggest corporation by 1870, and Alexander Cassatt was at the very top of this phenomenal business enterprise. And many of the new coming residences of Lower Merion were right along there with them. So Lower Merion was a hotbed of these railroad executives who were executives at the biggest company in the world. You can't talk about Haverford School, believe it or not. I say you can't talk about Haverford School without knowing who J. Edgar Thompson is. and very few people know about who J. Edgar Thompson is. He was the third president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was president during those years of 1852 until 1874. He was the chief engineer from 1846 to 1852, but he was working for a company that was not as well run as he thinks it could have been. And so he was part of the, you might call Young Turks. And they wrested control of the board of directors. He turned over a whole new group of board of directors. He became the president and was off and running. Though Thomas Scott was the one, he was the vice president, who discovered A.J. Cassatt, it was this guy, J. Edgar Thompson, who was Cassatt's greatest mentor. Actually, J. Edgar Thompson was pretty much everybody's mentor. In my opinion, J. Edgar Thompson is the greatest of all business corporation leaders. Now, if he's not the greatest, I'll stick with my guns. He's got to be in the top 10. He's that great of a business corporation leader. A little bit about Thompson's background. He was born of a Quaker family in a Quaker community, which was Springfield, Delaware County. He was a very wealthy man, but he displayed no trappings of wealth at any time. He was a plain living Quaker. He was never a part of high society. He avoided publicity at any cost. And he was described by many people who knew him, in fact, by everybody who knew him, as being dull and cold. I don't know, looking at your picture, do you think he's dull? I don't know. But anyway, during his presidency, the Pennsylvania Railroad was void of any scandal or corruption. It was void of any serious corporate infighting. The Pennsylvania Railroad paid a dividend every year from 1846 to 1946, 100 years. No other company ever did that, public company. The Pennsylvania Railroad, because of J. Edgar Thompson, was the beloved stock of investors and avoided by speculators. And it became, because of J. Edgar Thompson, the Pennsylvania Railroad became the railroad of engineers. Most other railroads were run and owned by stock market manipulators and people of that sort. Not the Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Railroad was run by engineers. It was an engineer's paradise. In fact, it was run, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the president was an engineer up until 1949. And until 1925, not only were the presidents of the railroad engineers, but they were all mentored by this guy, J. Edgar Thompson. Jay, along with running the railroad, along with knowing how to lay out in civil engineering, along with knowing how to build the finest mechanical complex in the world, J. Edgar Thompson engineered the corporate structure of what became the largest business corporation in the world. And this structure was revolutionary. And by watching his business career, that is the business career of Cassatt, anyone could conclude that Cassatt was a loyal disciple of J. Edgar Thompson. In fact, all the executives of the Pennsylvania Railroad were. The Pennsylvania Railroad came to be called the standard of the world. It was called that for a variety of reasons, but one of those reasons was until well into the 20th century, I would say until General Motors, the Pennsylvania Railroad corporate structure was the template for any excellent corporation of the industrial time. And it was laid out almost singularly by this guy, J. Edgar Thompson. And I say this presentation could have been even titled Thompson's Mark on Education, because many of the principles of J. Edgar Thompson were present in the early years of the forming of Haverford School. The creation of the Haverford School resulted from the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was the greatest period of economic growth in the history of civilization. It was a rising tide of economic prosperity that lifted nearly all boats. It was a period of unprecedented improvement in everyone's personal lifestyle and social justice. Lower Merion, with its Schuylkill River border and its natural path for the main line of the railroads, was front and center of the Industrial Revolution. From the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the Schuylkill River Valley produced more than 2/3 of America's industrial output till about 1870. And then the western part of the country started to take over. The Industrial Revolution was the backdrop to the founding of the Haverford School. Now, keep in perspective, just keep in mind that in the early 1800s, 1800, 1810, 1815, nobody traveled overland any faster than Ben-Hur of the Roman times. That is, nobody ever traveled more than 20 miles an hour unless they were falling off a cliff. Freight never traveled, whether it was over land or over water, freight never traveled more than 3 or 4 miles an hour. And for the most part, roads were built the same as they were built in Roman times. Bridges were built much the same as they were built in Roman times. For farmers, fields were plowed, seeds were sown, crops were harvested, all pretty much the same as Roman times. Homes were, in the early 1800s, were pretty much the same as they had been for hundreds of years in Europe. Plumbing and sanitation, about the same. Hadn't really improved in hundreds of years. Now, at the Lower Merion Historical Society, we have original records of burial grounds. We know who was buried in the cemeteries of Lower Merion, and we know why they died. We have those original records. They're for anybody to come visit and look up for yourself. Many people died all the way up until the early 1800s, the mid 1800s. Many people died from freezing to death, from starvation and from freezing. And we've also come to know that in both Philadelphia as well as the New York City area, there were severe wood shortages. So people just simply couldn't get firewood to put in the fireplace to heat their cabins or homes. And in a cold winter, they froze to death. All of this was changed by the Industrial Revolution, and Lower Merion was at the heart of it. Lois and Alexander Cassatt lived through nearly all of these changes and benefited greatly from it. But they also realized that many of these changes would present new challenges for their next generation, the generation of their children. The children of Lois and Alexander Cassatt and the community that they lived in had to be prepared for the future. Part of that meant this: cities and towns were having major increases in population. Cities and towns now had good sides and bad sides of the tracks. For example, in Philadelphia, you're looking at a picture there on the top of the Pennsylvania Railroad station at Broad Street. Behind it is the train shed, and behind that, the tracks go straight out to the Schuylkill River and on over to 30th Street. That mainline track formed what Philadelphians called the Chinese Wall. If you lived on the north side of the tracks, you lived in good neighborhoods. If you lived on the south side of those tracks, not such good neighborhoods. This happened in nearly every town that had a railroad all across our country. There was the good side of the tracks and the bad side of the tracks. There were other things to make a living. The use of time now had to become much more precise. Not only did railroads travel faster, but they traveled more precisely. That is to say, they could tell you that they were going to be at that train was going to be at the Haverford station at 8:42, and it was going to leave the Haverford station at 8:44. And if you or your freight showed up at that dock at 8:45 or 8:46, too bad. And that put a lot of pressure on people and businesses. It changed the way employers spoke to employees. It changed the way people worked. People and things were now moving a lot faster. As I said, unless you fell off a cliff, most people never traveled more than 3 or 4 miles an hour in their life, unless they're on a galloping horse. Now, people were moving at a mile a minute regularly with no problem. Not only that, they were traveling all year long. It used to be in the winter months you didn't travel because things were iced in. Railroads didn't care about ice. They moved almost 365 days a year. With the Industrial Revolution, the children of Cassatt and the other executives of the railroad were likely to work in business corporations where they were under pressure to produce by the clock. From now on, people wanted to know, what was your output this week? What was your output for the month? And executives had to have quarterly reports and they had to answer to them. It was a whole new pressure. Men were developing new health problems due to stress. Also, math, trigonometry, geometry now had everyday relevance and importance, and aware of the sciences took on greater importance. Under these circumstances, Lois Cassatt, with her husband, got together with the Haverford College and other of their mainline friends. When I talk about mainline friends now, I'm really talking about people like themselves who were of the industrial age. And they got together with that Quaker college, Haverford College, in an effort to establish a boys' school. As the planning with Haverford College came together, Alexander Cassatt put up $7,000 of his own money to be spent on building the new school. This photograph I just took is the original Haverford College Grammar School. That's where our Haverford School started. Alexander Cassatt, you can see that building with the stone base and the shingled upper on the third floor. That was the original school built by Cassatt. I believe he also built the end building, which is the brick base with the shingled top. That's the physical education. That came about a year later. That was the gym. The brick thing in between those two buildings was built by somebody else, and I don't know when. This building is there today. It's on the Haverford College campus. It's right near Lancaster Avenue and a Railroad Avenue, right across from the Tinderbox where everybody buys cigars, and Joseph Banks. But that's the original Haverford School. The Haverford College Grammar School was run by teachers and alumni of the Haverford College, and those people also were on the board of directors of Haverford College. And it was indeed a Quaker-based education. Now, all other members of the board of the Haverford College Grammar School were men with professional ties to industry, most of them with the Pennsylvania Railroad. We noticed on the board of directors, there are some people from the Baldwin Locomotive Works, and there's other people with International Navigation Company, among other industrial concerns. But interestingly, the president of the Baldwin Locomotive Works, who was on the board of Haverford, he actually started his career at the Pennsylvania Railroad under J. Edgar Thompson. And the president of the International Navigation Company, he was on the board of Haverford. He was also on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was the next door neighbor to Cassatt. He was on the board of the Pennsylvania Railroad. That's kind of mainline society as it was developing through the 1870s and 1880s. At the Lower Merion Historical Society, we have an extensive collection of maps of Lower Merion showing property ownership over the years. These maps display without question the changing makeup of Lower Merion residents to changing over to people of industrial interest. This picture comes to me from the Lower Merion Historical Society. It's the Haverford School class of 1902. This is the last class to be educated in the original Haverford College Grammar School building, the original building built by Lois and Alexander Cassatt. By the way, of a side interest, I want to point out that Cassatt's son, Robert Cassatt, graduated with his class in 1890. Robert Cassatt attended Haverford beginning in 1884 when it first opened until 1887. Then, like his father before him, he was educated in France for 2 years, then returned to Haverford School for his senior year when he graduated in 1890 with this class. He did a freshman year at Penn, transferred to Harvard, graduated from Harvard in 1895, and Robert Cassatt, went on to have a very good and successful business career. More importantly to what we're talking about tonight, Robert Cassatt joined the board of directors of Haverford School when they were no longer going to be under the proprietorship of Mr. Crosman, and were now going to be an independent nonprofit corporation. And so he joined the board then, 1916. That's when Haverford School moved over across the street to the Oaks, was now on that campus that we know today. And he was on that board for 10 years, and for 3 of the years, up until 1927, he was the president of the board of directors of the Haverford School. When pursuing the names of these students, it's easy to notice a generous sprinkling among the students' names of association with the Pennsylvania Railroad and related business industries. The Haverford School was absolutely part and parcel of what was becoming, and what had become by at this point, the main line. As I see it from my readings, this was a unique society, not based on extreme wealth and influence, but rather on the engineers' mentality that came principally from the Engineers Business Corporation, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Starting as a community of summer homes, soon Lower Merion was the primary residence for many executives of the Pennsylvania Railroad and other related industrial businesses. Beginning in the 1870s until 1954, 8 of the 14 presidents of the Pennsylvania Railroad lived in Lower Merion. And I just want to point out as a side note, 8 of these presidents, of the 8 presidents, 5 of them worked under the leadership of J. Edgar Thompson. And as a matter of interest, quite a few mid-level staff executives lived in the borough of Narberth, which is a wholly contained borough within the township of Lower Merion. So entirely, we were very much of a Pennsylvania Railroad area. It was these families who, I believe, gave a uniquely distinctive brand to mainline society. It seems to me that the characteristics of the main line in its time reflected to a large extent the personality of those who populated the executive positions of the Pennsylvania Railroad and related businesses. These were sober, pious men of industry who kept their aberration in check. They were wealthy, but there were no robber barons. They avoided publicity both personally and for their community. They took their work, whatever it was, very seriously. They eschewed frivolousness and conspicuous consumption. They were measured in their words and in their activities. They were provincial and insular, yet at the same time, very purposely, very worldly people, very much aware of what was going on in the entire world. At least to some extent, this is the mark on education that Lois and Alexander Cassatt, along with their new breed in Lower Merion of Lower Merion mainliners. I believe to some extent that this mark on education was noticeable even after World War II to the young men fortunate enough to attend the Haverford School. I thank you all very much. I turn this back over to Andrew. I just wanted you to have my contact information in case anybody wanted to contact me. Thank you, Andrew.
Perry, thank you very much for the wonderful historical insight. At this time, we do not have any questions, but if there's anybody in the audience that would like to use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, please click on the Q&A button. And also, Perry has been very kind to put his email and phone number there if you do have questions and would like to follow up with him in regards to a lot of the information that we have seen tonight, please do so. I'll give it a couple more seconds here. Perry, I cannot thank you enough.
John Britton, do you see that?
Andrew Hughes Of Cassatt's Cheswold estate, does any remain? I believe that the Cheswold stables were later converted into housing, and that in the 21st century, media executive Steve Burke of Comcast, then NBC Universal, called it home.
I can't say that for sure. My understanding is, well, certainly the main house is gone. And, it's a beautiful community of many large, beautiful homes. If there's anything left, it would only be what I would call an outbuilding, like a stable or a gatehouse or something like that. The main house, gone, as far as I know.
An additional question from Cliff Cohn, class of 69. Hi, Cliff. Thank you for joining us. Alexander Cassatt had a very famous sister, the painter Mary Cassatt. Did he or his wife, Lois, have any interest in the arts, or is that not something the Quakers were interested in? And then a follow-up to that is, did that have any influence on Haverford art collectors or collections on the main line?
Okay, the last question okay, Alexander Cassatt and his sister Mary Cassatt, there were about 4 or 5 children in that family, but Alexander Cassatt and Mary Cassatt were close siblings. They stayed in touch. That's part of why Cassatts would go over to France, and they would live with Mary. And Alexander Cassatt was quite interested in her artwork. Lois was not. And, someday, Cliff, you and I can talk about this a little deeper, but that tells me Lois was not interested in that sort of thing, in art and so forth. What influence it had on Haverford, I'm not sure, because I got to be honest with you, I never considered Haverford School to put a whole lot of emphasis on fine arts. They taught it, but it wasn't front and center. Mary Cassatt spent her life over in France. She spent very little, if any, time here on the main line, but she was very well known. And she was very well known among the executives of the Pennsylvania Railroad, obviously. So very likely many of those people collected her art, and they made money on it because it became very valuable.
Thank you. And kind of a follow-up to this from Mike Mitchell. Was there any evidence that Mary Cassatt ever visited the school or had any contact with the school?
I personally have no evidence that Mary Cassatt ever put a foot on campus anywhere. I'm not even sure she visited Cheswold. I don't even know that. My readings tell me that Cassatts went over there to visit Mary Cassatt over in France. She was devoted to her. For those of you who are unaware, people who know art would tell you, and I'm not one of them, but people who know art would tell you Mary Cassatt was a very well-known, very famous artist. She's actually much more famous than Alexander Cassatt. That's just the twist of fate. But no, I don't think she ever came to Haverford.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions coming in, so please bear with me. I will do the best as possible. This is from Elizabeth. Do you know when the Cheswold farm was sold?
No, I don't. It was probably after 1916, and I don't even know why I say that. But it was sold long after he died. Sorry, I don't know that precisely.
And was Lois a Quaker?
No, Lois is a PK. She was a preacher's kid. Her father was a Presbyterian minister. She's from Lancaster. Her uncle was James Buchanan, the brother of her father. Her father's name was Buchanan. And so her uncle from Lancaster was ultimately president of the United States. Her father was a minister. She was very religious. The Cassatts, when they moved to Haverford, were Episcopalian. They attended the Church of the Redeemer and supported it very much. Alexander Cassatt tithed, that is 10% of his earnings, so he says, went to the church, probably Church of Redeemer. He's buried there now.
And I can add on to that, the great class of 63 in their 50th reunion did a remarkable job of rehabilitating the headstone and actually fix that. So we're very fortunate to have some alums that really do appreciate the historical aspect of Alexander Cassatt and the history of Haverford. A couple follow-ups here from my counterpart, or from my colleague, George Wood, class of 75, comments that he believes John Fry lives in the carriage house on Cheswold, and he bought that home from George's cousin, Tim Houston, class of 1963.
Wow. Okay.
And
That's interesting. I was unaware of it.
an additional comment from Albert Early, class of 58, is Alexander Cassatt statue on horseback is at the corner of Montgomery Avenue and Grays Lane.
That is the only remaining monument to Alexander Cassatt. And that is a monument that venerates his work as township road supervisor for making the roads a better place. Has nothing to do with his railroad career. The sad thing about Alexander Cassatt, what I did not tell everybody in this presentation, in 1899, he became president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The reason was they were going to tunnel their way into New York City, which would be touchdown for the railroad. That would have been it. And he did a fabulous job. And he built this great station called Penn Station. And in the Penn Station, and it was all completed by 1910 after he died. But no doubt about it, that couldn't have happened without him. And so they put a beautiful large statue in Penn Station to Alexander Cassatt. That was a memorial. Well, guess what? In the 1960s, they tore down Penn Station to make way, I think, for Madison Square Garden or something. And the statue was found in the Meadowlands over New Jersey in a trash heap. And when that was discovered, that started the preservation movement in urban areas, including Philadelphia. Edwin Bacon of Philadelphia was inspired by that incident when he heard that Cassatt's statue was found in the Meadowlands, along with some of the dead bodies from organized crime, probably. But when they found that out, they said, no, we've got to quit tearing down our treasures. Pennsylvania Station was absolutely beautiful, and they just tore it down.
That looks like that's the end of the questions. Perry, I cannot thank you again. As we do conclude our discussion this evening, I would like to invite you to join us Tuesday, March 16th at 7 p.m. for our next Haverford Alumni in the Arena, as Ben Grant, class of 2007, discusses his second book, Overview, How We Change the Earth. Thank you, Perry. Thank you all for joining us, and good night.
Thank you all. Great to see you.